In today's Farm Report, oral land lease agreements can take off some of the burden for rentees and renters, but as the USDA's Rod Bain reports, having it written down can also alleviate other unforeseen issues.
You have probably heard the term, put it in writing. That's especially the case when it comes to any agreements involving property, such as leases of farmland. As Rusty Rumley of the University of Arkansas's National Agricultural Law Center points out,
there's this old law called the Statute of Frauds. Basically what it says is there's some contract promises out there that they're so important that the parties ought to put them in writing if they want them to be enforceable in a court. That's why when you buy or sell land, it has to be in writing because the Statute of Frauds requires it to be in writing. And it's the same thing with leases that take place for more than 1 year. Those are expected to be in writing.
Now, verbal agreements can only last for 1 year at a time and could be ruled unenforceable in a court of law if a dispute ever occurs. But Rumley says written documents cover unforeseen areas that a verbal agreement may not. For example,
you've got a landlord and they're renting out land to this tenant. A couple of months into the lease, the tenant decides this farming, it's not for them, but there's a guy down the road that's more than willing to pay the remainder of the rent if he gets to use the property for the last of the lease period. If there's not a written lease stating that a tenant cannot do that, general rule is they can turn around and hand that lease over to anybody else.
Another example where a written lease can clarify issues is in the area of hunting rights on a property.
Depending upon where you're at in the country, a lot of times the ability to lease the land out for hunting might be of actually more commercial value than leasing the land out for agricultural purposes. Does the tenant receive the rights to hunt when they lease the land for agricultural purposes, or does the landlord retain it? Different states treat it differently.
In some cases, leasing hunting rights on an ag use property to a third party could create a myriad of legal issues. Rumley provides another reason to put lease agreements in writing, establishing an end date to a contract.
With a written lease, you're generally going to have some end date in the lease. With the oral leases, they typically last for less than 1 year, but the way the laws kind of interpreted them over the years is if neither party gives notice that they want the lease to end, then the lease just renews at the end of the lease.
Now, cost is one reason parties to a lease may opt for an oral agreement. But Rumley says
written leases themselves, they're typically one of the cheaper things that you're going to find working with an attorney. It's worth spending a couple $100 to have an attorney draft up a lease agreement that fits what the party's actual intent is. It can save thousands of dollars in the long run if there is a dispute between the landlord and the tenant.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
After a cold November, we had a fairly mild December.
But boy, we are back into the icebox in January, at least east of the Rockies.
Causing a couple of concerns. Agriculture Department meteorologist Brad Rippey says concern number one, livestock. We've got temps down in the minus 20 range in the northern plains with snow and wind, and it could get down to minus 30 later this week.
And so the combination of the snow and bitter cold along with the wind, considerably increasing stress on northern plains and Midwestern livestock.
Especially stressful following that mild December. Second concern.
Winter wheat is not protected by snow at this point across the lower Midwest, and we could see temperatures later this week down in the 0 to minus 10 degree range across the lower Midwest.
Most other wheat has snow cover at this point. Also some good news for you southern citrus and vegetable growers. Yes, it is going to get cold.
But at this time, no freeze is expected for deep south Texas or across Florida's citrus belt.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Family farms continue, but as every family has to do, they had to plan for the future. Jim Sulfur with the University of Minnesota Extension Service Office talks about the future of agriculture.
I get asked the question a fair amount, mostly from my non-farmer friends, about what's kind of the future of agriculture, and maybe even people that are in agriculture wondering if they should encourage their children to go into agriculture or even think about it as an occupation. And I think, either the typical comment or the typical discussion kind of goes, boy, there's just so many changes going on. But I think if we stand back and look at what's happening, those changes have been going on for a long period of time. I know the dairy statistics better than crops, but I would suspect the trend is kind of the same. Minnesota actually topped out in 1944 in the number of dairy farmers, and that was 144,000 of them. And I guess you think about it that now, I would suspect we don't have 144,000 farmers. Back then, of course, most farms had dairy farms. Average cow numbers were really small. And we actually lost, we're concerned about losing dairy farms now. We actually lost a lot more dairy farms back in the 1960s when the laws came in that we needed to have milk rooms and bulk tanks and things like that. That was probably the period of time where we actually lost the most farms. So none of these trends are really that new. I think what maybe is new and different over the last 10 or 15 years is the diversity we have in farms. Again, I can speak to dairy farms. Back in the 1960s, if you had 100 cows, you were really a big dairy producer. And if you had 10, you were small, but most farms had between 25 and 60 or 70 cows. Now you've got just an extremely wide variation. We still have a lot of farms that have 40, 50, 60 cows, and we've got farms under one ownership in Minnesota that are over 10,000 cows, not on one site, but on multiple sites. And so I think that really is challenging, and I think it's scary to a lot of people. I think there's a lot of factors that are in force there. One of them is the shrinking compression or profit margins have continued to shrink on an average. They vary a lot from year to year. Another thing is the desired lifestyle by farmers. It used to be really proud that producers or dairy farmers would say they hadn't missed a milking in 20 years. I don't think there's too many new dairy farmers that are younger than 40 that would brag about that. They kind of like to brag about the vacations they go on. And so I think it's important that we continue to think about what the future of the farm is, and that farms are going to continue to change. I don't know if that's scary or not, but we need to continue to let market forces kind of change. And I think as a producer, as an industry, we need to kind of change with it and understand that we're kind of a worldwide national phenomenon. And if we decide not to go along with that long term, it's really going to only hurt our industry. This has been Jim Salfer with the University of Minnesota Extension in St. Cloud.
The Agriculture Department and many others are working on a national campaign on soil health, encouraging producers not to plow up the land, to plant more cover crops to restore soil's natural nutrients and water storage abilities. Some involved in the fertilizer and farm retailing business have expressed some fears of lost sales.
But I actually see that as an opportunity to expand what we're doing right now.
Gary Farrell of Cheney, Washington, is chairman of the Ag Retailers Association. He told us if farmers fully embrace these new but old concepts,
it may take away from our nitrogen sales, but then maybe they'll have more money to spend on the micronutrients that they haven't spent money on in the past.
And more cover crops will open up new opportunities.
We can find ways to produce cover crop seed. We can help sell the seed to the farm community. We can utilize that their nutrient management plans.
Farrell thinks farmers will still buy fertilizers and such, just different types. And if cover crops and double cropping catches on, there may be more crops in need of fertilizers and such. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.